So welcome to my channel again. I'm starting up again after having had quite a break. So my name's Mahabodhi. I'm a Buddhist in the Tree Rattler Buddhist order. And today I've got David Murrin interview. So I first came across David a couple of years ago. I'd started writing, I've been writing a book for a long time, actually, since 2003, but back in November 2021, I started to try and unpack some of the things that were happening in the world, like health and safety craziness and the beginnings of woke and all those sorts of things, and postmodernism. And I ended up trying to understand, well, what's happening here? There's this ridiculous kind of polarization happening in the world, between left and right. And a friend who'd come across David's book, Breaking the Code of History, told me about him, and I thought, oh yeah, let's have a look at that. So I bought the book, and it just completely answered a lot of the questions. So David's got the idea that empires go through phases, so 5 phases of empire, and America is in the final phase of empire, which is decline and legacy. And that in that sort of phase, which began with 9/11, he proposes. So in that phase, what happens is you get a polarization and a fight over resources. So it completely explained what was happening and continues to happen, really. So yes, I was really keen to get David on. So on his website, it's got a number of predictions that he's made. So in 2003, he predicted that America had moved into decline. And he made that public on a CNBC news item, March 2010.
It was actually made in 2023, literally like a year and a half after the 9/11 incident.
2003, you mean? Yeah.
Everyone laughed at the time.
Yeah. Well, I remember reading it back then about, end of empire or something. I remember other people talking about it, then 2007, he predicted Obama would win the 2008 election, and his election would confirm America's decline based on the historic point where the underclasses rose to power through the democratic significance of the non-white vote. He says, and it just carries on like this. More predictions: Ukraine war, US-Chinese trade war, Trump getting elected, those sorts of things. So do you want to kind of outline, David, your story with all of this? Your origins and when you were in Wall Street, and how you came up with the theory of empire. So.
I mean, someone once said to me, "Why did you think of it? Why didn't someone else?" Which is such a great question, actually.
Yeah.
And so I'll answer that question as we go through. I mean, first of all, I think I was a family that was linked to empire. So my grandmother was a Mem Sahib in the Indian Army, and my grandfather was in the Indian Army. And so it was tangible, that kind of process of Britain had an empire, and I knew the generation that was part of the last phase of it. And also my family fought in the Second World War, which was, particularly relevant. And I think, interestingly, I was always fascinated by war from the earliest age, the embarrassment of my mother, and fascinated by not just not the bloodshed, but actually why we did it and how we did it, and the qualities of humanity that really shone through at the extreme moments of bravery, initiative, love for one's comrades, all sorts of qualities which were really, I believe, defined us. And I didn't think, from an early age, I felt if you wanted to unwrap who humanity was and what we were, you had to study conflict. You couldn't study hemlines and, social patterns on the wall and wallpaper designs. It had to be this innate sort of thing that we did horrendously, regularly. And that comes back in spades as we talk about the end of this particular articulation. And then I traveled a lot, so I considered the world to be a small place, not a big place, thanks to my parents traveling and taking me with them. And I studied physics. which was particularly relevant because physics is a mindset that teaches you to look for sort of the most fundamental reasons why matter and the universe is the way it is in equations that look so simple but are immensely powerful. So I love the idea of elemental ideas that have profound impacts. And then I ended up going to Papua New Guinea as a geophysicist and watching tribes on my first day of work sharing emotions. In this particular case, Augustus, the son of the chief, decided he didn't want to work. And there I was, a 21-year-old in a helipad in the middle of the Sepik jungle. And he started to get apoplectically angry, which was in itself concerning because he was well armed and there was no support for 100 miles. But then, interestingly, this emotion of anger spread across all of the other 60 to 70 Papuans in my workforce. And within a few minutes, they were all apoplectically angry and brandishing edge weapons and bows and arrows. And I remember thinking, I'm going to die on the first day of work. And I managed to take inspiration from my grandmother, who was, very courageous. And I jumped into the middle of them and slowly walked like a Pink Panther character. And if I could see myself, it was a sort of a bit like the Peter Sellers slink as I moved through this mob, willing them not to chop my head off and somehow getting through them. And I got through this incident. And I remember about 3 or 4 hours later, they were all vacant on the floor. And being a physicist, I sort of thought this is really interesting. They're like charged capacitors that were charged with emotion and collectively charged. And then they had a time decay function and then all emotion disappeared and they went back to normal and got on to work. It was the bizarrest thing ever because in our society, if we're angry, it can last for a generation. It can last for weeks. We can hold our emotions, but theirs seemed to just ebb and flow with the discharge of others that they shared. And I thought I was having the privilege of looking back into human history and who we were. But in fact, as we'll come on to, it's actually not about the past, it's about who we actually are. And then in a job switch about 3 years later, I ended up on the floors of JP Morgan. And I didn't realize how privileged I was to join one of the best two houses on the street with some exceptional people. But as I sat on the trading floor thinking, I know nothing about finance, I was a good scientist and I just watched. And first thing I noticed was people seemed to get very emotional over money, which surprised me because it was okay to get emotional over losing one's life or life-critical exercises that I experienced in the jungle, but not the idea that money and suddenly personalities jumped up and down. And then I realized that we are no different from Papua New Guineans. We're sharing collective emotions. And in watching the behaviors on the trading floor, I was watching modern man be like Papua New Guineans. But the only difference was our threshold of individuality was higher. So it seemed less obvious when we were infused with a collective emotional pattern. And that got me into the idea of predicting markets through price behavior and emotional behavior. And I did that very successfully, and it resulted in me setting up an early hedge fund, and when hedge funds couldn't be spelt by most people. And as we moved on to 9/11, I remember observing 9/11 and thinking, oh my goodness, what if that isn't an accident? What if it's a bigger event than just a successful terrorist attack that got through the defense of the intelligence agencies? What if it's something more? What if it's the beginning of the end? And that was at a time when everyone thought that under the neoconservatives, that basically democracy would last for 100 years because the Cold War would end up with the vanquishment of communism. And, as far as I'm concerned, the period then was the heyday of what did we do with democracy to ensure the world was democratic? I was asking a very different question. How could I answer a question of, was that the beginning of the end of the Western world or the cycle as we know it? And the first problem in answering it was I couldn't find price patterns that went back long enough because Western civilization probably goes back, I would say, in this cycle to the 12th, 13th, 14th century. So then I decided to invert an organizational process based on the price patterns I'd seen in markets into this, what I call the 5 stages of empire. 3 impulse waves of expansion, regionalization, a civil war, which lateralizes society, expansion to empire, and then maturity, overextension, and decline. And I decided to use wars as the clocks of empire. And I define wars in very different ways because wars are not equal. They are quite complex in terms of the nature of the protagonists. And, a good example was, what would happen if you had 2 teenagers fighting, 2 20-year-olds fighting, a 20-year-old fighting a 60-year-old. The nature of that conflict then is different if you think about its energy. So I use this different definition of the types of wars as clocks of empires, and I became staggered when the results dropped out very clearly, all the way back through great Egyptian cycles of organization, that we as humans were doing the same thing. We were rising and falling with social coherence and losing adaptation and productivity, and then we were knocked aside by another system, as nature abhors a vacuum. And that was really the beginning of the whole concept. And the things that also are relevant is I'm dyslexic, and dyslexia is an interesting process. We tend to think of it as a real disability through our educational system. And it is, because we're taught as linear thinkers, and yet lateral people and dyslexics are probably 66%, I'd say, of all lateral thinkers think very differently, and they have to squeeze their way through an educational process. And I couldn't spell for a toffee. In fact, was embarrassed, even at the age of 25, 26. So the idea, of writing a book, which came to me in 2005, when I'd been speaking publicly for 5 years over my theories, was really all about the children. And I had I had one child already, and I had two twins, full stop, so to make 3 children in total. And I decided I had to write about what I'd learned and the structures I'd understood about the way empires formed and what it meant for us, because we were on a sliding slope, not an upward slope, as many people thought. And that's really the product of breaking the code of history. It was really an amazing experience for me to learn to be able to write so I could understand it the next day. What's sort of relevant, though, about this process is I also looked at European systems and empires, and their duration tended to be compressed between the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English, Germany trying twice as a Christian and then as an atheist nation, in America. And I asked the question, is that because technology shortened durations of empires? And I came to the conclusion it wasn't, because in fact, all of the empires I've just listed were part of a super Western Christian empire, which was a mimic empire bonded by a set of religious values. And those religious values started with the Catholic faith, the civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics. And the Protestants were a maritime power. They had far greater lateralization. They created democracy as a result of it. And they went on to build a global empire. And that process basically defines how we are where we are right now. And then there's one other piece of the puzzle, which was a man called Kondratiev observed there were 56-year cycles and there were wars at the peaks of the cycle. He interpreted them as much more commodity demand cycles. But as we'll come on to, I think all of this can be phrased in the concept of living in a universe of entropy. And as a good physicist, having built these ideas, and sadly they've proven to be very accurate, I kept thinking, what is it that drives us into social organization? And my answer came when you think about the world as entropic. The universe we live in, if we stood still, it would fall around, everything would change in front of us. And to live is an act of anti-entropy, to organize ourselves, to fight disease, to be coherent. And anything that survives with its DNA has an anti-entropic quality. And so the human survival system is based on anti-entropy. And the empires are the product of self-organization that build maximum anti-entropy on the way up, and they become entropic on the way down, and they get swept aside by new systems.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've got this, because Buddhism is all about the middle way between extremes of eternalism and annihilationism. And it's a bit like a hill, so to stay in the middle, you have to make effort, and that's anti-entropy, and it's
exactly what it is.
And when you just stop making any effort, you just fall down one side. You either give up or you fall into sort of some rigid system or something, Yeah.
And that's a really good analogy, because actually one of the things, I love science fiction films, and Star Wars is one of these great battles between dark and light, entropy and anti-entropy. And interestingly enough, when a system becomes old and sclerotic and mature, for the sake of collective humanity, it has to be swept aside because it's no longer making progress. So even if it's swept aside and challenged by something that we would call dark, it's part of a evolutionary process which keeps the evolutionary productivity working.
Yeah.
And in that process, it's very important that we sort of understand one thing. In Star Wars, it was 2 Sith that brought down a galactic empire. How can 2 people bring down an empire full of so-called Jedi that for a millennium had been, controlling and creating anti-entropy? And the answer is this, is that the universe is entropic. So it might take us 10 people to push a heavy barrel up a hill. It only takes 1 person to give it a little push backwards. It overwhelms the 10 people and it rolls down the hill.
Yeah.
And so the reason why dark, destructive habits are so easy to perpetrate is because they're in line with the universe around. And collective human anti-entropy is the anomaly in that case. We do it through conscious, coherent action.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting sort of insight into the damage that dark forces do so readily. and harder it is to get them back on track.
Yeah. I can really see that happening today, you know, the way that people just have clung to, you know, the people are afraid to speak about various things a lot of the time. And it's, you know, it takes a lot of effort to actually go in the opposite direction. Yeah.
Well, I think that's also another phenomena, and that is that you touched on it a bit, but it's really quite a big theme in terms of understanding how human systems work, is not all humans are the same. And when we go and watch the Olympics, we know that we're not going to be running the 100 meters under 10 seconds unless we're very, very few people. We accept that. We accept that, you know, some people can jump higher other in a basketball game. But what we don't accept is our brains are structured differently. And I think that humanity splits into two subsets. One are the ancestors that come essentially with the hunter-gatherers. They're lateral, they're adaptive. And the result of that process is that, you know, they are used to flowing with anti-entropy and they adapt to it. And the other comes from the agrarian burst of the population size. And that's a more linear agrarianism, which is about regularity, regular feeding of animals, regular plants, regular cycles. And they've generated two very different dimensions to the use of our brains and their hemispheres. And what happened was the lateral hunter-gatherers migrated to actually be the warriors, and the warriors became the leaders. And dare I say it, it's not that you couldn't lead as a linear person, but the qualities of leadership are not the same. They're far more incremental, like heading a factory, than they are, that's well established, than they are about coming up with a new adaptive policy in war. And what we have in the West, and we're experiencing right now, is extreme pendulum swing of collective linearity. And that's because decline, in terms of this right-left dynamic or lateral linear creative, you know, more sort of rigid framework, is empires are always built by lateral people and agencies. They do bold things that are unexpected, and they build huge institutions, which gradually, as the system no longer expands, become institutionalized and allow more linear people to take their role of systematizing. And institutions and organizations are like a disease. They just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they throw people out who then don't, you know, think the same way. And one by one, the lateral creators are thrown out, until by the time you reach decline, what you've essentially got is a whole linear system with the lateral exiles sitting in the fields looking down rabbit holes. And what's really made it extreme in Britain, West case right now, is the success of money printing is unprecedented. And what that's meant is the perpetuation of the same ideas and the resistance to external adaptation. And so we've got an extremely linear system that faces a far more adapted system in terms of the challenge from autocratic systems like China, believe it or not. And they're looking and they are adapting to bring us down. And that's why the hubris that you have in the West, hey, we're strong and you can't do it. We're completely wrong. We're completely the wrong way around.
Yeah.
They are very, very dangerous because they're highly creative in this space.
Yeah. There's a great series on YouTube of Victor Davis Hanson talking about great generals. So he's got Patton and Sherman and Ridgway, is it, in Korea? And it's like these are all people who did brilliantly in wartime, but in peacetime they're just, you know, and then they're exactly that sort of person that just needed, that could see clearly what needs to happen and all that.
Well, I speak, you know, for to our senior officers in their staff college, or have done for the past couple of years. And last time I decided to do something a little bit different. And I said, look, you know, if you are left-handed, left-eyed, dyslexic, highly artistic, would you please move to the left of the theatre? And if you're not, stay where you are. And they did. And there were also a lot of Ukrainian officers there. And I looked at the people who were on the right side and said, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to break this to you, but you're peacetime commanders. Odds are you are linear thinkers, and you don't like lateral thinking because it's disordered. And if you serve the people you lead rather than yourself, and you want to surround yourself by the characters you don't like, to lateralize your system, because the history of taking linear organizations into warfare is very clear. You don't survive. You will not survive. So you need to make that decision. Of course, they're now looking at me disapprovingly. And then I go to the other side of the room and say, look, you guys are naturally, somehow you've got through the linear process of selection without being kicked out. And you know full well that you will adapt. and you will increase the adaptation process, but you need to also surround yourself on the second tier with linear thinkers who can execute detail and process, because this is a symbiotic relationship. So both of you have to modify what you do and understand what you do it. And there's sort of lots of humming and ahhing. And then, of course, I look over the Ukrainians and say, may I ask you whether you have any linear thinking officers left? Are they alive or dead? Do their command survive? And they all say they're dead. They didn't survive the first days of the war. And so it's very clear to me that, and it's a topic of my book that's soon to be published called Breaking the Code of Wars, which examines why wars keep happening. And they happen because they're part of our social evolution. We use wars to sweep aside systems in decline that have become highly sclerotic and linear. And we replace them with expansive lateral systems through the combat system of war that then actually produce huge peace dividends. And if you look at Pax Britannia and Pax Americana, post the hegemonic conflict between Britain and France, which led to Pax Britannia, and then the hegemonic conflicts between Germany, Britain, where America interceded and came out of it strongest. We've had 70, 80 years of peace and huge advancement. So the advancement doesn't just come in peace, it comes from the system that wins the war, is at its base level highly lateralized and adaptive. And the linearity of it's been squeezed out completely. It takes time then for the linear institutional people to get back in and get back control and start destroying the system ready for the next change. So we are stuck in this, it's destructive creation is the best way to put it. And for anyone that doesn't believe that wars happen or don't want to, until we recognize that we destructively create our evolutionary process and find a substitute for it that's less destructive, we are locked in that cycle. And any peace period between a conflict and is just a peace period before the cycle reasserts itself of human evolution.
Yeah. I've got a little diagram of the different Kondratiev waves. Do you want to have a look at that?
Yeah, pop it up. Come on.
Yeah. Can you see that?
I can.
So you've got these different technologies that were there, and then, so the whole thing about innovation coming, you're talking about systems dying out and then you need some innovation to come out of things. To drive the next wave. So
you see, I would just talk about this a little bit. The peak of the Kondratiev cycle that dominated what was the War of 1812 actually was in 1808. And so in 1808, and the Napoleonic War started in 1798, so 10 years before, because the pressure, this sort of pulse of entropy, which is a Kondratiev cycle, and then engenders conflict. Always, the conflict starts before the peak. So that's one area. The next peak basically happened around the time of the American Revolution, around 1864, and then the next peak was 1920. So the First World War hegemonic conflict came in essentially 6 years before the peak of 1920. Then the next peak was 1975, the peak of the Cold War, which was essentially a struggle between, a communist, atheist system that was a commodity-producing society against a Western society that was democratic and a consumer society. So of course the Kondratiev cycle dictated who was wealthy, and the communist system looked unstoppable into the peak, and it looked absolutely rubbish from the peak onwards as inflation dropped in the West and commodity prices dropped. And now we're into the next peak, which is about 2030. And I believe that World War III started in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. So could you say a bit more about that, about what you think might happen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most painful realizations for me was when I studied Kondratiev's work and I picked up the low in 2002, 2003. And as an investor, I'd really capitalize on investing in commodities when people didn't want to. And once you accept that you've managed to get a wave like that and it worked, then you also have to accept that there is a peak. And historically, that peak brings conflict. Now, I would highlight conflict as being slightly different every other peak. So the major peak is about 112 years, 2 Kondratiev cycles. That takes us back to World War One with Germany's challenge against Britain. It takes us back to Britain's challenge against France in the Napoleonic Wars. And it takes us back to France's challenge against Spain 112 years before that. So we know big things happen every 2 cycles. And we know smaller things happen in between. The American Civil War would be one. Could argue the Crimea War was a little bit early, but of the ilk. And the 7 Years' War was exactly the same before the Napoleonic conflict. And the Cold War was a non-hot war. We felt it was big at the time, but it wasn't a world war. It was in abeyance. So what we're in right now is not like 75. It's twice the magnitude. It's exactly the environment that takes the world into World War III. And I remember thinking, and Breaking the Code of History is full of warnings about this. Its main message was we were, unless we did something about it, would have to push back a Chinese challenge that would lead to World War III, into the peak of the Kondratiev cycle. And we're here. And I started with Breaking the Code of History, warning people what it really meant. So it isn't as if I fell out of bed yesterday and came up with the idea. It goes back to the origins of it and before when I was speaking about it. I then wrote 2 defense warnings. One was in the 2015 period when we continued to spend money on defense, and I warned what that would mean with Russia and China and the war that would follow. And then I wrote Now or Never, which was basically in 2020, which was a document that got ahead of the defense review that just saw more arms cuts at a time when we should be going the opposite direction. It even got into the hands of Boris, who used the word now or never and then forgot about it. So it was just our politicians have been linear, blind, and failed to realize the threats we face. I also wrote a book called Lions Led by Lions, which is specifically about how the British Expeditionary Force won the Battle of Amiens and essentially won the First World War with new technologies which combined arms weapons of tanks, artillery, planes, and mobility in a way we'd never seen before. And I think we think of the First World War as an abject sort of loss of humanity and waste, and yet we failed to realize that Britain was instrumental in breaking the German lines and changing the course of the war, both on the land and the continent, and also by sea power, by the blockade that was subsequently after Jutland enabled. And more importantly, when America came in and the neutrals that were feeding the Germans could be cut off, the peace not talked about. So it explains that conflict, and it also talks about the lessons for China, well, war with China. And then lastly, I wrote Red Lightning, which was in about 2021, because part of this process where a hegemon is challenged by another hegemon, in a military sense, follows a pattern. So if you're a hegemon like Britain was, you had enough money to build 2 fleets to take on any other powers, 2 powers together. The 2-power standard, it was called. And everything was overturned by the origin of the dreadnought. Now, Britain rolled out the dreadnought first, but the dreadnought idea came from the battle between the Japanese and the Russians, where big guns at long range engaged successfully. So there was a drawing on the Italian drawing boards, on the Japanese drawing boards. Just Britain got there first. But the trouble is with dreadnoughts is they invalidated every battleship ever made before. So this great empire with this huge fleet suddenly had an obsolescent fleet that had to go into a competition with Germany, which we almost lost. We just stayed ahead, which resulted in victory at Jutland. So the Germans emphasized an asymmetric challenge through U-boats and almost brought us to our knees with the Battle of the Atlantic. And that's important because in the Second World War, Germany did the same. They used U-boats rather than the Plan Z to build a matching battle fleet, which they just couldn't do in time. And they tried to use U-boats to bring us to our knees. So what all hegemons that challenge come up with, because they don't have time and money, is they create weapon systems that shift the balance in their favor. And I call them hegemonic weapons of challenge. So when the Chinese started to modify ballistic missiles to kill carriers in 2018, that's when I started to really scream that everything I feared was coming true, because American power is predominantly based on carrier power. Negate those carriers and you really put a dent in power projection for America. And that's what the Chinese plan to do. And we have a situation today, which I've been warning about for years, where the number of missiles they've created, the ability to defend against them and not be saturated does not exist, which means that I believe the plan for Chinese expansion, which is all part of the Russian move in Ukraine and the Iranian conflict, which was initiated on the 7th of October, this is now a coherent plan masterminded by Beijing. They've had their weapon systems proven in the Red Sea, because essentially the US Navy can't keep the sea lanes open with very basic anti-ship ballistic weapons coming in their direction. So God help them when thousands of these things are fired off in the first hour of a war. I don't think there will be a Japanese or American naval ship within the second island chain an hour later, and then all the bases will have disappeared. So we're not looking at a war over Taiwan. We're looking at a war that extends Chinese influence to the second island chain in very short order.
What's that, second island chain?
It's basically a chain that goes all the way around. It encompasses the Philippines and it goes all the way through Japan. Right. Just about. It's not far off the Empire of the Sun, and the extent of the Japanese Empire. And then once they pushed America out of the region, they'll try and push them out of Australia. And then America has a huge problem because it has to fight to get back into space, whilst its air force might be doing damage to the Chinese. And they will have built an industrial coherent base on a scale never seen before. And their shipbuilding capability is equal or greater to America's in the Second World War. Give them 4 years and they'll build a Navy 1,000 strong and come out and take ocean by ocean. So we're talking about a 10-year war. And this war is not going well. We're led by the weakest leaders in the West we could ever have. And one of the things that I talk about is that these expansive systems and dictatorships are definitely characterized by this, are led by what I call human predators. They're not the same psychologically as the majority of humans. They prey on humans who do not understand they think differently. And they're advantaged by the fact we project ourselves and our own makeup onto them, and they can use that camouflage to do damage to rise to the top and then take the world into conflict. So we're at the hands of two of the greatest predators. Let's say Xi is the greatest human predator in hundreds of years. He is a very sophisticated animal. And he is masterminding his alliances with Russia and Iran. They're now coherent. And we are sleepwalking into conflict. And the magnitude of it is going to just shock everyone because we didn't think it was going to happen. Now, it shocked people in 1914, but they didn't have the precursors of a war in Ukraine, which is as big as Stalingrad squared now. And yet we're still in denial. So why does the West sit in denial? And there are three reasons why I believe we are. One is because in Pax America, as we had in Pax Britannia up until 1914, no one could believe there could ever be a war of a global scale because we were far too human for that. We were far too economically entwined to have that happen. So that's one form of denial, which I would say up until 2 years ago had validity, but it doesn't after what's happened in Ukraine. And the next is something really interesting. It's by money printing has created hot air that's kept the stock market at the peak in the US. And that creates a dopamine construct within society where the cortisol hasn't kicked in and people refuse to look at the threats coming their way.
Yeah.
And last but not least, it's the own goal of money printing, because now you create a thoroughly linear system that has no adaptive lateral thinking to say, what if they think differently from us? What if all those missiles were fired in the first hour? How does a carrier and 3 destroyers protect against an incoming 55 missiles? It can't. There's no lateral thinking, because the lateral mindset of the Biden leadership and the Sunak leadership is the world is on its railway tracks and they refuse to see the evidence it's far from it. So those three things are almost compounded together to create a state of Western collective denial that is just obscene and ultimately could harbor the end of our civilization.
Yeah. As a Buddhist, I just got, I'm thinking, how do you respond to all this? I mean,
this is very interesting, and I was hoping you were going to ask this question because, as we were talking earlier, I think Buddhism has a particularly profound role in human thinking, but there's a difficulty, and the best way I describe it is constructs like Buddhism work really well with 80% of the population. But when it comes in contact with the more malevolent 20%, and I'd say 18 of the 20% oscillate between appearing to be nice people and not, and they're quite less conscious about the not, but they can still do you harm. When you come to the 2% of human predators, they are doing just that. They are preying on good nature. Yeah. They are preying on love and all of the things that humanity aspires to, and they use it against everyone to control them. And so I think the idea of the Taoist warrior monks is really, and there were Buddhist warrior monks too, that basically protect against these darker forces and recognize them clearly and act. whilst at the same time propagating very positive messages of, of spiritual growth and interrelationship. But they need to be protected. And all you've got to do is go back to the idea the universe is entropic. So if it's entropic, you can't assume anything. You can't just glide anywhere. You've got to create protective mechanisms. So I think we've lost perhaps the combination need that the Taoists and the Buddhists in various periods actually had in their warrior monks.
Yeah. I mean, the way that it works in Tibetan Buddhist iconography is that you have the peaceful deities in the center, and that's the temple. That's but then outside of them, you got the wrathful deities who are protecting and keeping out the dark forces and not letting them into the mandala. So I think I really agree with you that that side of things in Buddhism isn't emphasized. Well, it is emphasized actually quite a lot in our movement, but I think there's a lot of just going along with things and just trying to be nice and hoping people will be kind to you, and they won't.
It's a personification of allowing, and allowing. The belief is if you allow with good spirit and good heart, then positive energy creates positive energy. But I would argue that's fundamentally flawed, because the universe is entropic, and these malevolent predators are structured differently, and they literally prey on that energy. So unless you develop self-defense mechanisms, you will be subsumed one day or the other. And I think it's far more conscious to have two skill sets. One is one of self-defense, and seeing what we don't want to see, and understanding there are energies which are fundamentally very different that we may be forced to go up against for the sake of our principles and ideas and to protect those we love. And at the same time, know when you're in a safer space to operate without the protective mechanisms kicking in so that you can maximize the safe space. So I think that the duality requires far more consciousness for it to have longevity. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people think when you talk about meditation, they think about relaxation, but stimulation is as important. It's like to have your energy there and present and alive and awake. And I think that's more the kind of the warrior side of things, and that's what those like Shaolin monks were doing. Really, they were, being ready for anything. And obviously they would. A lot of it be defensive, but there wouldn't be just a pushover.
I do think there's the fusion between Asian philosophies, which so many of the philosophies are now being borne out in quantum mechanics, have real validity, and also the process of the West where we do. And the best thing, the analogy which I kind of live by, is imagine this river 2 miles wide, somewhere in the Orient. And you fall off the back of the freighter and the thing steams off and the river is just too wide. Now, you have two options. You can be a Westerner and say, I'm going to try. And you start swimming for the bank, but you don't make it because you exhaust yourself. That's probably not a good route. Or you can be a good, Buddhist or Taoist, and you just float and you relax and you look at the world and you just stay chilled. But actually, something then happens. Some hours later, up ahead, you see a large cliff, and the river seems to separate the flows between this cliff. And so you work out that on one side, most of the river goes to the right, and to the other, there's a small tributary. At the key moment, you may take 4 strokes to the left, and suddenly you're in the other flow. And when you get into the narrow river, you take 4 more strokes and you walk ashore. So I think that this whole process of the fusion of East and West is very much knowing when to act and when not to act. And when not to act is about allowing, and then storing up your energy, as you say, for this just key moment when you can change outcomes consciously. And so the idea of creating, and you see this now, people have accused me of being a warmonger because I'm warning that conflict is coming. Now I'm warning because I know this conflict wasn't started by the West. It started by a predatory activity that people just find too hard to face because they can't imagine that such evil really exists, as we call it. But I also think that we need to see the threat to then galvanize ourselves to then act. And that's one of the biggest problems, is no one wants to see anything that's painful or difficult or scary. So they just prefer to stick their head in the sand and their bums in the air.
In that Victor Davis Hanson set of talks, he talks about that Patton, people like Patton and Sherman, they were really good at protecting lives, actually, doing the, not having the least amount of people killed,
really good lateral generalship. I mean, Wellington was exactly the same. He's one of my great heroes. I mean, Wellington was brilliant because he understood how to win decisive battles, whether in defense or offense. He understood the use of terrain. He understood the components of various regiments, some strong or weak. In Waterloo, for example, he took the strongest English regiments and matched them with the weakest Dutch regiments, and then put a Hanoverian regiment in between who was average. So he built this composite system of strength that reinforced. So he had a really acute understanding of logistics, human psychology, terrain. And Sun Tzu is very good at expressing these concepts that we tend to laugh at in the West, which I think we really should.
The art of war.
Because the Chinese have used it against us. Yeah, the art of war has been used against us for 25 years, and we didn't know it had been because we were so hubristically blind in the West. But you're exactly right. Great generalship saves lives because it creates decisive outcomes when poor generalship would just have an attritional conflict.
Yeah. So do you know, if I put up some of the diagrams that are different phases of empire, do you want to just comment on them a bit?
Absolutely, pop them up. What a good diagram.
So let's have a look at the, which one was this? The Western Christian Empire. Where are we?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier, this is the first super empire that I basically noted was the Roman Empire, because you had the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, and together they made a Roman super empire that perpetuated values and ideas through 2 cycles of duration very successfully. So that alerted me to this other model that, how could you see these curves? So on the left-hand side, you can see the green one is the Portuguese, and the gold one is the Spanish, and the blue one is the French. Now, predominantly Europe and continental Europe at that stage was Catholic. And along came the movement of Protestantism, which was protesting for direct access to divinity. And it's no coincidence it came from Germany, but it really took root in Holland and Britain, where self-responsibility was a function of high ratio of coastlines to internal volume, high lateralization, high self-responsibility, and that also brought with it this sense of increasing democracy and maritime power. So it was Britain in the white curve that really, Holland started, and then Britain really took over, built the first global maritime empire. And that was what surged the Western world into this huge peak. And the peak of that process was 1914. If we really go back to the power of the Western world and the power of the British Empire, it was unbridled. I would say the British Empire into the 1900s, and then 1914 with the rise of Germany and America industrially, they were just waiting to make their move. I always argue that if Germany hadn't gone to war with Britain, America would, because it was equally as potent and powerful, and it coveted the global status. So the First World War was, in fact, the peak of the Western Christian Empire. And that peak came at the beginning of Kondratiev's cycle, as we talked about, or 6 years before the 1920 peak. And World War II was really just part 2 of part 1, because it hadn't been concluded and Germany had enough expansive energy to try again. And it almost did at that time. But it also intermingled the first Asian challenge from Japan to the Western powers. And really what we're seeing now with the challenge from China to the West is a continuation of that super Western Asian empire batting against the super Western Christian empire. And America in blue, on the right-hand side, is the last of the Western Christian empires of this cycle. It went into decline in 9/11. So it isn't just a decline of America, it's a decline of the whole Western construct of how we think and how we operate, and our lack of coherence, lack of adaptability and productivity, which has been supported by printing of money and increased linearization and not enough adaptation, making us extremely vulnerable. And the only way really to restart a cycle is to wipe out, one way or the other, the linear rigid nature and reborn adaptation. And that's what conflict could well do to us if we get through this next huge challenge, and I hope it will. But we've got a long, deep path for that to happen.
Great, thanks. And a bit about
this is like an exam. This is like a memory exam. Can I remember what the diagram I created was about?
Yeah. So I could. Asian super empire.
Just run down them, and I'll just do them all. I'll run. Let's flick them down.
All right,
we'll do them
all right.
quickly.
That's all right.
Go from the top one up there. Just go. Okay, and we'll just run through these. So this is basically the 5-stage basic model. We talked about it earlier. First stage, regionalization, a civil war that takes place that lateralizes a society and militarizes it. It then expands down through expansion to empire algorithmically, taking its neighbor, making 2 units. Then it's 2 units against its next neighbor, that's 3 units. And it just literally accelerates its way up to a national topographic geographical limitation and enters maturity, where you see tolerance, open-mindedness, integration, probably the more balanced and most balanced point of human existence, because there are still some maverick thinkers left alive and the linear people haven't got control of it. But gradually, as linearity increases, lack of adaptation, rigidity comes in, you move into overextension where the system just doesn't start to pay for itself. It's a hidden phase because very often you only see it subtly in the finances of the empire, which still looks phenomenal until some event like 9/11 shows the world that actually things are not as they should be. And the decline starts to unfold rather dangerously. There's a Kondratiev one just below, actually.
Well, this one.
Okay, so this is a really good illustration. This was made in 2005, yeah. This is a Kondratiev peak cycle measured by inflation. And you can see the Napoleonic Wars on the left-hand side. Well, that's the big hegemonic conflict. The American Civil War looks bigger in this basis only because it uses an American CPI index, in effect. And it was a big event for America, but not for the world as a whole. World War I, we talked about the next big hegemonic conflict. The Vietnam War, the next intermediate localized conflict, inverted commas, even though great powers are involved. And the Asian War, which is really what this war with China is all about. And I'm afraid this whole spike is now moving into a really accelerated phase of commodity constriction and inflation. So when the Bank of England or any central bank tell you rates are coming down, don't believe a word in it. Inflation will go up because of resource constriction, which is all part of the ever accelerating dynamics as two systems come into open conflict. Wars and empire, here you go. So these are the basic kinds of wars that you need to think about. Wars of expansion so the regional war has a civil war. Obviously, civil wars are between 2 sides. But they're still different, as we'll come on to. Then you get wars of expansion, where the expanding system constantly picks fights with anyone else. And Britain was semi-democratic and it did it successfully and expanded. So don't ever think that democracy doesn't do this. We do it. Every system does it. Just like every virus wants to expand, a system is a virus, effectively. And then you get these mature peak phases. Now, at the peak, between right, lateral, and linear, there's often a conflict. And in Victoria's period, it was a constitutional revolution that divested power from the monarchy to parliament. And it didn't require a war, a civil war. But really what's happening quietly, if it isn't happening, is a transmission of power from lateral adaptive, expansive thinking to more linear thinking. And that's what the internal battle is, where the civil war after the regional process is about producing greater lateralization. And then, of course, on the way down, the system is just constantly involved in wars, trying to maintain its borders. So now it's been impinged upon by an expanding system, and it's running a series of defensive conflicts, rather than wars of choice when it expands when it wants to. And I think the big issue about this is the wars on the left, a system takes on by choice. The wars on the right are ones where it has no choice. It just has to fight for the boundaries and survival of the system. And this is how these wars look in character. So obviously you've got in the early stages the Anglo-Dutch wars and the Anglo-French wars. And then you end up with this whole process of Trafalgar, at which stage Britain is the expanding system and expands. And then you've got the First World War, which is a peak war, the Second World War, which is part 2 of the peak war. And then you've got this big black arrow, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. And then this really is an interesting arrow, because this is the point at which the Asian super empire started to really have a go at the West. And the first part of it was Japan's challenge against Russia in 1905 with the war that took place then. And then there was obviously the Second World War with Japan. And then Korea was another aspect of it, supported by China, and Vietnam. So the wars that the war that's unfolding with China is not unique. And we need to tell ourselves that these past conflicts have been taking place where two super systems have been locking horns. Only the difference is the West is weaker than it's ever been, and under China, the Asia is stronger than it's ever been for the next round.
Great. That's good, absolutely.
How am I doing? Have I remembered my name yet?
You're doing good. I know. Oh, American Empire.
Okay. Yeah. So this is all about the social dynamics of change, and I've looked at the American Empire, and you can really see how, the American Empire. And again, I don't want to be racist. I want to describe these things as processes which are clearly delineated in society that we can learn from. And I don't believe that we should be having a cancel culture that just rewrites history we find inconvenient, because it erases the lessons that we need to build upon to build better systems. So I'm really violently opposed to this cancel culture, because otherwise, how do we learn from history and take responsibility from it or for it? So the expansion of the American system was really a white-dominated society, an overclass that was white. And then as it moved towards the peak after the Second World War, and this is interesting, and predominantly because more and more black people fought in the Second World War. And therefore, if you fight for an empire, you have a right to be a citizen, no different from the Roman Empire. So that influence was really taking a hold. And the Tuskegee Airmen is a really great and inspiring story of exactly that. And the film by Spielberg is really worth watching if you haven't. But then basically something interesting happens. As you roll over the top and the poverty line moves up through society, essentially you end up with greater birth rates, greater demographic expansion from the lower portions than the upper portions. And so you come to a point like Obama, where Obama, who came from the underclass, came into power. And it's always typical in an empire system that it marks accelerated decline, because an underclass representative wants social integration, social justice, fairness, all of those things, and fails to recognize that essentially all of those opportunities come through an empire that had boundaries that have to be defended. And Obama's 8 years was the greatest give back of American power in history. Only Biden has accelerated beyond that and reached new peaks. And that's exactly what the rate curves on the right represented.
Asian super
and here you can see the representation of the Asian super empire. Essentially, Japan was first, China's second, and India is, going to be the one that is behind China, but is the challenger in waiting, in effect. And this whole sort of acceleration to global power has been taking place. And now under China, they're really into the blue patch, frightening into the blue patch, which means they're lateral. And we can see that because they produce 50% more patents than America, which is terrifying. They're innovating in their weapons technology in a way that is really shocking, because that's exactly what I predicted. But it's not good for us because they're adapting and we're not adapting as fast. So this challenge is well and truly on, and the West will be very lucky to get out of this mess, because the initial stages of the onset of conflict will be so destructive that with our weak leadership, as it was, for example, with Chamberlain, who's much stronger than, I would say, Biden and Sunak by a factor of 10, even so, he shook and shuddered under the shock. And if it wasn't for Churchill, Britain would have gone under.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the word polarization. Very interesting word. I thought I'd made it up, actually, when I first came up with this early in 2000, because it wasn't used very much. But basically, systems that are winning are become more polarized. If you look at the pride with which Chinese people view themselves as being Chinese, because they're part of a system which has grown, expanded, and is now an equal power to America in all ways, it's like following a winning football team. So the system really polarizes with its own collective values, and essentially it have a very strong identity, which is hard to break. Think of the Nazis as having a very similar self-identity, and look how hard they were to break is a good idea. And the Han Chinese are no different, in my opinion. Now, what we face in the West is the opposite. Literally, our system has. Why are you proud against with a system that's falling apart, doesn't work, doesn't produce, constantly in conflict with itself? And so self-identity is becoming less with the collective or the empire system or the national system, and far more about self. So all of these movements we see in society where we produce two things: greater narcissism, because self is allowed to give vent, and the other one is this whole thing about self being more important than doing or producing, is very much a hallmark of decline. And I'm afraid it's rife in the Western world. And both the Russians and Chinese have used giant great hammers to take those cracks and create canyons through which our society is suffering, whether it's a support for Hamas, which is not spontaneous, but perpetrated by Qatar, Iran, the Russians, the Chinese, whether it's the whole process with, I don't think Netanyahu's conducting himself very well, but I think making him a war criminal when Putin wasn't first on the list seems as if we've lost control of another international entity like we did with the World Health Organization. So there's a lot more at play than just face value. I think the West and people that read the news need to have far greater insight, which is what my Correllations is about, giving people greater insight into what's really happening, not just feeding themselves on the story or slant that someone else wants to give them.
Great. Phew. Brilliant. So I had a few questions. One of them was, this thing of decadence coming about in the sort of as an empire sort of goes into decline phase, and I was confused about the fact that I thought Nero would be a sign of the Roman Empire kind of falling apart. Fiddling while Rome.
Well, he
was in the early phase.
Yes, I think he is far more an indication of what goes wrong when a predatory, dysfunctional human being has total power than it was about where they were on the cycle. Right. Yeah. And you look at the struggle in Greece and the struggle in Rome between the Republic and the Empire. And, they understood the reason why. Get a bad emperor and it's a disaster. Get a good emperor and it's the best form of governance you can have. Get a bad one and it's really bad. Hence, the concept of the Republic, which is a more stable average. You don't get a super bad one, you don't get a super good one. And we've had that battle, whether it's in Athens versus Sparta's hierarchical leadership, or whether it's Rome or democracy versus autocracy. That battle's all over the place. It's just been one of these human constructs of, I think the way that we really need to do is, I think we need democracy where our political leaders need to literally qualify to be above a certain standard of a person before they can be elected, and they need to be educated properly in history, both military and civil, so that we should have qualified leaders, a bit like Singapore has qualified governmental members. But we also need to have psychometric testing to filter out these human predators, because wherever you go, wherever you put them, they are highly destructive. Unless you want to have a hitman, metaphorically, you probably fit the bill. If that's where you're running as a black ops and you're an intelligence agency, this particular character type will always destroy social integrity and always bring the system down. So we need to be far better in the way we create the elements of leadership in our society and more demanding. Yeah.
Well, it seems like there's kind of, the softer people get with all this woke culture and stuff like that, it's more like they let in those sorts of people more, Well,
they do. I mean, look, the trouble with the woke culture, inverted commas, is on the way up, people suborn their individuality to collective because they're proud of the collective they are part of. On the way down, it's the opposite. Self is more important than the collective, and no one's prepared to put anything into the organization. And it's all about what you think and who you are. So we have a woke culture which just really wants to be identified for doing nothing apart from being like, I wear purple hair today, therefore I'm important. Whereas on the way up, if you didn't achieve or do anything, you didn't have importance. And that was productive for society. So we've created a culture which just promotes non-productive elements of society. And that is very dangerous. And look what's happened at the MOD, where they couldn't get the right fighter pilots because they were white. So what do? You eject all the good ones who would be good fighter pilots just for your diversification quota, and that's meant to defend you against an enemy that doesn't have limitations like that? Are we mad?
Yeah.
It's really like what's interesting is that this whole linearization and this whole sense of self, all of these systems act like viruses. They don't stop voluntarily. They stop because they've consumed everything they can. There's nothing left, and then someone else stamps on them.
Yeah.
So, but we need to be more active if we don't believe in that.
Yeah.
And the cancel culture and the woke culture is absolutely detrimental to the vibrance and survivability of our Western social organizations.
Yeah. I mean, Rob Henderson talks about luxury beliefs, and it's like it's like that. These are all these woke beliefs are things that people with lots of money often have. It's like
they used to call
no pressures on them.
Well, they were called champagne socialists in a prior era when communism rose. So there's a parallel to it. But I think what's really interesting is how Russia and China stamped it out. They didn't stamp it out because it was self-freedom. They stamped it out because it was non-productive to building a nation that both leaders wanted to take to war.
Yeah.
And I don't think there are many woke values floating around in Ukraine now, because under Maslow's hierarchy of needs, survival is far higher than whether or not I have a coloured banner in my trench. And so it is, you quite rightly say, it is a luxury of a high-level civilization that's at peace, but it also creates the very weakness that then promotes subsequent conflict.
Yeah. Great.
I look forward to all the hate mail that'll flow through to this, but
me too.
That's just how it is.
Yeah. Well, it's been really great, David. I was a bit nervous beforehand, but I think that was because it was important, having this conversation. And I think you got some amazing insights and great ideas. And it's nice. I mean, I didn't mention, but I'm a fellow physicist. I've got a physics degree from Manchester University, 1977. So, yeah.
You're older than I am, then.
Yeah. So I love big ideas like you. So.
Well, I really.
Hey. So there you
go. Well, one of the things, as a fellow physics student, really annoys me that there we were in our quantum mechanics classes, and some professor would be saying the observer changes the outcome. Well, really, what he should be saying is the observer conscious? Like, consciousness changes the outcome, not the observer. And therein is the interesting thing, is there's more and more evidence that our brains are based on quantum mechanical computing systems. So the reason why consciousness changes outcomes is because we are part of the quantum reality. Now, that's the most exciting thing, that you could come out of science. And trouble is because most physicists aren't like Einstein that see concept and mathematics. They just get stuck in the mathematics. And that's really sad, especially at a time when quantum engineering is changing our world. Quantum philosophy is equally as powerful, and it suffuses with Buddhism and Taoism in a way that I think is incredibly exciting.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really important, isn't it? Consciousness, as mindfulness is the key to everything, and that it ties in what you were saying about knowing the time when you need to act or not act. You're floating down the river. When do you need to make the decision? And I think because everything's always changing. You got to stay aware all the time, and not just think it all.
And I think it's a trust in your inner processing to know when to act. You've got all sorts of amazing senses in the human mind, and the trick is to turn the one that says should I go now, and just go, I will feel the signal when I need to go. I know what I program myself to sense the signal, and I know, and then you get the signal and you act decisively. And I think great generals had that ability, probably a little less on the consciousness, but intuitively they had those. They knew when they had to act.
Yeah. Great.
Well, I've really enjoyed our time. Thank you. I'm sorry if I made you nervous before.
No. It's part of the process. I needed to get nervous to make it good.
It's been really fun speaking to you. It's a real privilege to speak to a Buddhist. It's the first Buddhist I've ever spoken to on a YouTube.
Okay.
And I love that, because I share an awful lot of your sense of the world.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks very much, and good luck with it all. Yeah.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. See ya. Bye.